Hello and welcome to another session of Talking Absolute Worship. And it's a delight to welcome you back. It's a delight to welcome Blair back, but it's also a special delight to welcome Anne, who is coming to join us. And Anne, you are most welcome. It's great to have you with us. Blair and I are much relieved because we had to do one of these where we just talk to each other. And I'm sure you are going to bring into that conversation a degree of wisdom that we were groping towards. So it's good to have you.
Thank you.
And friends, we find ourselves with an interesting selection of readings. As usual, I'm going to invite one of us to start off a bit of a conversation. So Blair, I wonder where you are going to head with these readings.
Yes, thank you, Neil. Good morning, everyone. Good to be together. And I thought that I would look at the reading from Genesis primarily this morning in my preaching. I'm also prepared to say a few things about the reading from Luke, Mary and Martha, but I wanted to focus this morning on the reading from Genesis, which is such a wonderful reading, really. The visit of the three visitors to Abram and Sarai, and the promise of a child to Sarai at a late stage in her life. So we're looking at Genesis 18 verses 1 to 15, and it's good to begin, I think, with sort of how difficult was the situation for Abram and Sarai and at this late stage in life, and how unbelievable it was that she could give birth that late. The Genesis 17 suggests that she was 90 and that her ancient husband was 10 years older than her, and yet comes the promise of a child. And so the Frederick Buechner in a commentary I read that he wrote suggested the place to begin is with laughter, the reasonable laughter that came from her, really, the doubting laughter, the disbelieving cackles, if you like, of laughter that came from her. I've got a quotation. He writes, she laughs because her baby is going to be born in a geriatric ward, and the midwife in the local surgery is in for the surprise of her life. She laughs because sex at her age is less likely to cause conception than it was a cardiac arrest. It didn't bear thinking about. She laughs because if, against all the odds, this really was going to happen, then she, along with the whole barren country, would really have something to laugh about. Babies out of barrenness, flowers from the desert, new life for the nearly dead. This is either the stuff of nonsense, or if by some crazy chance it is true, it is the stuff of joy. And so he kind of suggests that we're honest about how hard it was to believe for them, and indeed how hard it is for us to believe that new life can come to us in dire situations, in a way, you begin with understanding why she thought it was impossible, and why because we sometimes think it's impossible as well, and then working our way through that. Should I keep going? I can keep going, but if anybody wants to jump in, feel free.
No, keep going. You're on a roll,
okay.
my brother.
Okay,
so you
okay,
keep going.
okay. Okay. The thing that I think is worth noticing about it is sort of a strange text to our modern ears or modern eyes, full stop. The three visitors who appear from nowhere, who at one point are said to be men. At another point, there it's said, depending how you read it, they're said to be God. And so there's this, here are they three individuals, or are they God? Are we talking about the Trinity here? Certainly traditionally, as I understand it, the church tended to see the Trinity in this, but I doubt whether the ancient Jews would have seen it that way. But there's sort of a mystery about that, that what's going on, and then the other bit that's sort of odd for us is I think the odd way in which Abram falls over himself trying to be hospitable. He could hardly stoop any lower. He's so excited to see them. I think the New English says that he says, since you have come to my house, do not pass my humble self without paying me a visit. And then he runs in to Sarai and asks her to. Well, I think he gives her a sack. Does he, or she asks him for? So here it is. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. Quick, he says, get 3. Well, in the Good News, I think it's 3 sacks of flour. In the RSV translates it as 3 measures of flour. The NIV translates it more accurately, in a sense, as 3 seahs of flour, which is to say 39 pints. Or if you do it in my Bible footnotes in my NIV, it says it could also be 36 pounds. In any case, it's a lot of flour, and you would have thought it would make for a lot of bread and a long time of preparing as well, a lot of cooking to prepare that flour. But that's okay, because in the meantime, Abram goes and picks out a calf and an animal, and asks his servant to kill it, butcher it, and cook it. Or he tells the servant, all that's got to be done while the visitors are waiting. Now, I've been to restaurants where this kind of thing appears to be happening while you wait for your food. It always leaves me feeling a bit agitated. And so there's a whole sort of, it's a bit distant from us in our experience, and it's told in this wonderful way, but it bears a tremendous truth in it that I want to get to eventually. But again, I'm happy for either you to jump in at any point. Do feel free to jump in if you want to.
I think what you've done rather beautifully is something that I don't suppose, in a way, it's so obvious from the text, but you've pulled it out, is that actually there is a length of time to this visit. It's kind of, it's very, you read it and it's so sparse, it's kind of, you can almost, the danger is you kind of think these three appear, bang, conversation, off they go. But as you're describing it, this is hours of hospitality, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is a like you say, if you were in the restaurant, you would probably have walked out the door. The 3 visitors would be saying, "Oh, for goodness sake, we'll go to the tent next door, because honestly, you guys are just taking so long."
Yeah.
But that's the wonderful thing about this image of hospitality, isn't it? That actually it is about, you take time to be hospitable, and you get the best ready. It's not like, what have we got lying around? It's actually, what Abraham is kind of demonstrating, and what Sarah are demonstrating is these visitors really need the best of us by way of welcome. And that's when you then play with the sense that, angelic visitors, the Trinity, however you're going to play with who these visitors are, that's quite a powerful thought.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, yeah. There's often a sense for me with biblical texts that they leave us wanting more, don't they? You're wondering what else happened. And I think for the biblical writers, often those things were not as important to them because they weren't as important as the overall point that they were trying to make. In this case, I mean, there's a number of things in this text I think that are sort of interesting for us. It says something about ancient hospitality rites. How did they receive visitors, for sure. There's a little something here about the traditional relationship between men and women, I have to say, as well. Abram's outside, Sarah's in the tent, and prepares the food. But the big, really important, I think, thing that was important for them, and I think was important for us too, is it with God anything's possible? Is it that God can bring new life out of the desert, and babies out of barrenness, and hope out of despair, all of those things. And it's a very powerful text in making that point. And it does, this movement of one kind of laughter to another kind of laughter, because of course Sarah does laugh with joy when the baby does come eventually, but we begin with disbelieving cackles, cynicism. It couldn't possibly be true. That's in us as well, and we look at the events of our own lives or in the world, and we think, well, nothing good is going to come out of this, but if God is in it, then magnificent things can come out of it. That's sort of the big message in it. I love that message, and I think it resonates with people's experience in life as well. Most people in the pews will have had memories of thinking nothing good could come, but it did.
Yeah. Powerful stuff. Yeah. That's great.
What I do with the first text. Yeah. Shall I go on to what I?
Well, I was just wondering, Anne, were you particularly going to home in on the Genesis?
I was kind of, I sort of looked at the 4 readings and I was seeing some links between them.
Okay.
And I was sort of quite drawn to the Luke, to the Gospel, to the very familiar story of Mary and Martha, but also that connection between the Genesis story and the Luke story of hospitality, and and what we offer those who come to our homes and into our sort of company, but also a sort of connection actually between all 4 about what happens when we encounter God. So obviously, as Blair has talked about with the Genesis reading, the Colossians reading, is all about the implication of our reconciliation, is that what is the phrase, we continue securely established and steadfast in the faith, and this sort of sense of growing. The Psalm is very much about those who come to the house of God live these kinds of lives. Their relationship with God has this impact, and of course the Mary and Martha story is about the impact of this visit from Jesus on them. But one of the things that struck me about the Luke passage is some of the risks, because it's just, I think one of the risks is it's just such a well-known story. So I think one of the things that I would be wanting to think about when I'm looking at this is how we actually tell that story, whether we just read it straight or whether we actually pause a lot more when we listen to it. So maybe do a kind of bit of Lectio Divina kind of stuff in worship and read it, 2 or 3 or 4 times almost, if we can encourage our congregations to do that, and to read it really slowly, and to ask some of those really important questions. What's going on here? Where are you? What are you hearing? What phrases are resonating? That kind of stuff. I think another risk of it is that we just set up this dualism between Mary and Martha, good sister, bad sister, which is just so unhelpful. And I think another risk, and it's linked to the dualism, is that we end up kind of dismissing Martha, which for some people in the congregation actually can be really distressing, because actually they see themselves as the ones who make the soup for the soup kitchen, the ones who make the tea after worship, the ones who bake the cakes to give to the food shelf pantry or whatever. So that it's kind of, how do we sort of mitigate those risks, or at least explore them and say there's a risk here. And so what I was really struck with is, first of all, where this story fits in Luke, that it comes after the parable of the Good Samaritan. So we've had the parable of the Good Samaritan, and Jesus kind of saying, what you do is you love your neighbor. And who is your neighbor? Well, this is your neighbor. Make it as broad as you can make it, folks. You do stuff, okay? But then he goes to Mary and Martha's, and he kind of contrasts that with, and you listen and you learn. So what you do, you love your neighbor and you love God. And it's kind of, it's not that one is more crucial than the other, it's that actually both become really important. And I'm just kind of really struck by the fact that in our church, we can sometimes pit those two against each other. So we might have those who will say, we need more prayer, and we might have those who say, we need more food banks. But actually we need to find a way of bringing them together. And of course, in this story, Jesus acts as this extraordinary mediator, who actually, these two sisters, I mean, it's really interesting, they don't talk to each other. Jesus is there in the middle. You think, oh yes, that person who's going to sort everything out for us. So Jesus kind of brings these two sides of faith life together. And finds a way forward, and I love the fact that he seems to have extraordinary compassion for Martha, and he goes, Martha, Martha, and you can always imagine him taking her hand and saying, it's okay, I know this matters to you, and that's all right, but this is just look at your sister. And of course we don't know what happens next. We don't know whether Mary and Martha actually did look at each other and actually say, yeah, okay, let's see where each of us are coming from. But there's something about relationship, there's something about transformation, there's something about conflict, and how we engage in the fact that conflict, and these two conflicts are actually quite common in churches. It probably comes up most church meetings, most elders meetings, something will come in where somebody will say either we're not spiritual enough or we're not doing enough. So I think this conflict comes in. So yeah, there's all that going on. But I think it's the familiarity of the reading, though. We have to be really aware that people will think, oh, I know this story. Yeah, that's okay. I've had so many sermons on this. We did this in Sunday school when I was 2.5. So it's breaking through how we kind of maybe think, how can we bring it fresh? And as if we're hearing it perhaps for the first time.
Yeah. Blair, you were also, I think, going to head a little towards Luke.
Yes.
Do you want to carry on the journey?
Well, no, I liked what Anne said. I like particularly the contrast to the Good Samaritan story, which precedes it, which in which, as Anne has said, the message of it to a certain extent is well, what he says is go and do likewise at the end of it. So go and do, if you like, at the end of that text, and the message, you could argue, in this one is sit and learn. And they're two quite contrasting messages in a way that I think it's fruitful to hold those two things in tension. And I think we have to do that with lots of things in our faith. Well, the faith works question, Paul's emphasis on faith, James' emphasis on works. You could argue it's a similar sort of thing, and that both are important. And whenever you emphasize one to the exclusion of the other completely, you're in trouble. And I think that's sort of the general point that Anne was making, and it's a good one. I looked a little bit at Fred Craddock's commentary in the interpretation series, and he kind of noted that the radicality of the story, to use his words, the radicality of the story is worth noting. That Jesus is received into a woman's home. No mention is made of a brother. He teaches a woman. Rabbis did not allow women to sit at their feet, that is, to be disciples. And I think it's just worth sort of noticing that, here Jesus seemed to practice a kind of inclusiveness that Paul arguably didn't practice. I mean, it's a whole debate around what Paul thought about lots of things, but in 1 Corinthians 14:24 or something like that is the text where he says that the women shouldn't speak in church, and if they have any questions, they should put them to their husbands at home on the quiet. And indeed, he says it's disgraceful for women to speak in church. So there's that's coming from Paul, perhaps 25 or 30 years later. Jesus, there is something about the inclusiveness of Christ that's quite remarkable. I know there's moments where his inclusivity, the Syrophoenician woman, and people outside of Judaism, that there's a whole story about that. But it seems to me that the early church was moving towards inclusiveness. I think you get strains of both here and there, but you get more and more strains of inclusiveness in general, and with women and with the Gentiles, as we get into the New Testament further, and coming from an ancient sort of more strict and rigid exclusive chosenness that most of Israel felt very deeply about, and sort of a more rigid sort of hierarchy of everything, really, including men and women. And I think that it's wonderful. It's just worth noticing that Jesus does something just by going into a woman's home and teaching her, and that was radical for that time. It doesn't seem radical to us, but it was for that time. It's worth noticing.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. I mean, I think also, Anne, I'm really struck as you were reflecting on kind of in a sense, this is one of those stories that it's quite easy to get hijacked by, or that has been hijacked. I was intrigued, with your list almost of, ways in which we could take this story into places that is not really where this story is at. And kind of another one, as you were talking, that just sort of struck me is this temptation that I think is writ large in the life of the church of is kind of the activist or the quietist the right way to be faithful, and so those who say, not just sort of contrasting prayer and doing, but actually almost the sitting back from the world and just listening, compared to the charging around of Martha doing. And I mean, I guess it would be fair to say that on the whole, the YrC tends to be a bit more in the activist kind of camp. And it's interesting, isn't it? We've had conversations in the past on these recordings of how if you want to introduce silence into worship, how you have to be quite aware of that may not be something that people are very used to. And that actually what you do with silence, you know, what am I meant to do? It becomes significant. And I was really struck your idea of maybe just because it's a short text, just reading it a few times and actually just saying to a congregation, just sit and listen. And there was one of the things that I found in one of the commentaries was there's a woman named Linda Stone who I don't particularly know her work, but she's a writer on technology and you know what living in the 21st century surrounded by technology is doing to us as human beings. And she had a great quote. She said, the disease that we all are afflicted by is continuous partial attention.
Interesting.
And I just thought that was a lovely phrase, continuous partial attention. Because we're always, you know, I'm listening to you, but actually I also want to have my phone open just in case. And it's just it's an interesting, you know, what does it mean to be confronted by a biblical text? I mean, any biblical text, but maybe this is one that really does it par excellence, that says, when was the last time you really listened to what God might be saying? And, you know, I'm thinking back, Blair, to where you were as you were reflecting on Abraham and Sarah. You know, what's interesting, one of the things about the laughter is that one of the visitors is listening very carefully to Sarah.
Yes.
You know, you laugh. No, I didn't laugh. I didn't laugh. No, you laughed.
Yes, I heard you.
I may be sitting over here, you know, and you're in the back of the tent, but I definitely heard you laugh. You know, it's just interesting that this sense in which we graze things, you know, we bounce off things. I mean, I read I mean, I don't want to get overly preoccupied with technology, but I read something else that said that for a lot of people, YouTube has become the major way in which they get their news, which is interesting because when you go on YouTube, I mean, well, first of all, you can control what you get to some extent. You can seek it out. You can also start it and end it. You can jump, you can fast forward it. But actually quite a lot of YouTube, I mean, the whole point of what's on a lot of YouTube is it's short, it's brief. And, you know, there's a real difference between a 2-minute segment and a half-hour, 1-hour debate. And I guess it's just interesting that here's Jesus kind of almost, just saying, look, actually everything has its place. But for Mary right now, her place is it's just really important that she can pay attention. And
there's something about it being the whole picture, isn't it? And I mean, I personally, I never use all 4 readings in one service, but actually exploring these 4 for this week, that there are actually some profound links about that long haul, that throwing your whole self in. It kind of flows through actually all 4 readings this week. So it's sort of, it becomes, you know, what do I pick out? Where do I draw in, and how do I, you know, am I going to draw some imagery from another one of the readings, maybe without using it all? I don't know. So
would you I mean, in the light of that, Anne, you've opened yourself up to the fact that we're now going to ask you, so So we've got a Psalm and we've got Colossians. You've touched on Colossians. Should we just home in on the Psalm for a little bit?
Yeah.
What was there stuff in the Psalm that was particularly, because I think you're right. I think there are some rather wonderful connections to be drawn. But if you just turn to Psalm 15.
Psalm 15, yeah.
What things were striking you there?
Well, I suppose because it's a psalm of it's a psalm of commitment of those who are going into worship. I think it lends itself wonderfully to be used actually as a call to worship and as a blessing at the end, a sort of to sandwich the service. I mean, I love using sort of trying to sometimes pick up words that we've used in the call to worship, using them at the end of the worship as well, because it's you could use it in a very legalistic way and say, are you good enough to come into worship? But actually, you know, that's not what it's about. It's actually saying those who worship God will actually become this kind of person. And I think it's really important, if we, you know, to remember that's what it's about, that it's not a checklist of whether you're good enough. It's actually an affirmation of what God is growing within you, and so I think that's one of the ways that I would look at it. But I think it lends itself really well to be used responsively. And it's got a question and answer sort of sense to it as well. And I think to use it at the beginning of worship as a kind of, you know, this is who the people of God are, or what we are growing to become. And then at the end to remind us, this is what we do now that we go out from our worship into the world to walk blamelessly and do what is right and speak the truth. And stand by our promises, kind of thing. So it's got that kind of drawing us in and sending us outside of it. And like all of the passages, it's got this thing of God changes you. An encounter with God will always change you. And that kind of, so I think I might use the psalm liturgically within worship, which is what I often do anyway, and you know, to be read in a responsive way. And I think that sits alongside, it also sits alongside the kind of Jesus the mediator reconciliation stuff that's going on in the Luke reading, you know, because actually if we walk blamelessly, then maybe we might stop pointing the finger at the Mary or the Martha, whichever one it is that annoys us, and actually see their worth, value what they bring to the community, so that actually we might walk more humbly with God. So there's all that going on there as well. Yes.
Powerful. I mean, I was very struck. I just, you know, paraphrase the psalm as a list, and it kind of it's just such a great list of things not to do and things to do. And it kind of has that feel a bit of, you know, the fruits of the Spirit in Galatians. It's every now and then the Bible just gives you these wonderful little lists. Nice. We'll return to liturgy in a moment. So we haven't said so much as yet about Colossians. I don't know whether either of you wanted to dive into Colossians. He said, hopefully.
Well, I'll just to affirm what you both have said about the Psalm. First of all,
Go for
jump in with that, and then have a look at Colossians.
Go for it.
I liked what Anne said about rather than a checklist, before which I think often with these lists, I got to say I feel myself, anyways, falling considerably short. And thinking it rather as a list to be grown within you. It's difficult, I think, because it begins with, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent, who may live on your holy mountain, and the bar is set high as to who can do that, and you know, you could find it a bit discouraging if you're honest about how you measure up against this list. But I think that it's always with a view towards improving our behavior. The stories, by and large, are told, and the poetry is written to urge us on, and encourage us to do better, and not to make us fall flat, but to say it is a high bar, and these are some of the distinguishing characteristics of this people we're called to be, and it's good to meditate upon those things and to think about this is where we're aiming at. This is where we in some ways, of course, we might feel we do fairly well with some of these things some of the time, and or maybe most of the time even. But it's about pointing us in the direction that God wants us to go, and if we have to face the fact that we're falling short, that's appropriate as well sometimes, to see I'm not the person Christ wants me to be yet. But I've got this goal towards which I work.
So there's that sense of being a work in progress.
That's right.
Okay. And Colossians, then, is that where we find some other of that sense of the growing and the becoming?
Yeah, I mean, I would have said so, because it's something about the impact that that our connection with Christ has on us. Like I said earlier, there's this, that I love this phrase, that continue securely established and steadfast in the faith, and just this whole sense of growing in our faith, that we aren't just kind of flailing around, failing miserably. Actually, we are, like we just said, a work in progress, and actually this wonderful truth that when we fail, which we inevitably will, God says that's okay, just keep going, don't. Whereas so often, our world actually shows a huge lack of mercy towards people who mess up, and it's interesting. I mean, I'm a bit of a soap opera fan. I watch Coronation Street, and sometimes I just find myself shouting at the screen, why won't anybody show that character some grace? And they have a vicar in it, and he just doesn't talk about grace half as much as I would if I lived on that street, and you just think, come on, this is what we desperately need. People need to know that yes, they've messed up, but that's okay. God still loves you, and actually there are, resurrection, reformation, salvation, whatever you want to call it, is a possibility. And I think there's something here in Colossians that's just this. This is what Christ's work is about for us. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah.
It certainly begins with the supremacy of Christ, doesn't it? It's
absolutely
amazing imagery, and I got to say, amazing imagery for a man who grew up as a Jew. Whatever we think about where in the church history the idea of the Trinity developed, how early it was in the New Testament. Golly, the image here is of God and Jesus before all things, at the very beginning of time, kind of setting the planets in their courses and the stars in their places, the huge sense of the supremacy of Christ in the text. I think that God was in him from the beginning, and he was in God from the beginning.
Yeah. There's a lovely story that I sort of came to mind, not least reading that opening bit of Colossians. I'm old enough to remember the days when David Jenkins was Bishop of Durham.
Mhm.
And David Jenkins got into all sorts of trouble as Bishop of Durham because he was a very clever, thoughtful guy, and he didn't, he thought lots of big things about God and Jesus, and the media were very good at kind of extracting one line from a very carefully thought argument and then pillorying him, and he was often in trouble. But he told a lovely story. It's in one of his books. I can't remember which of his books it's in, but he tells a lovely story. I think it was his daughter had said to him, Dad, I don't know, I wish you would find a way to talk about God using words of one syllable. And so he said, that's a fair challenge. I will try. And he came up with this sentence, which he does admit he does break the rule once in this sentence. He can't quite keep, but this is his sentence. God is, he is as he is in Jesus. Therefore, there is hope.
Yeah.
And you read that opening of Colossians. Well, you read the whole bit of what we've got in Colossians. And it seems to me, and I'm thinking back to Anne and her raging against the vicar in Coronation Street who won't bring grace into the conversation. There is something. There is something enormous, but also something incredibly intimate, I think, in what Paul is doing in that bit of Colossians, because you get that the cosmic Christ, but then you get us.
Yes.
And how we are being transformed.
Yes.
It is a staggering. I guess this is one of those Sundays where it's interesting that as we've talked about them, there are so many threads that you could weave between all four.
Yeah.
And I guess the challenge for the preacher is going to be, what don't I?
Yes.
How do I choose what I'm not going to cover?
Yes.
Otherwise, or else I say to the congregation, okay, sit tight. We're going to be here for a few hours.
Yes.
And I just have a feeling that in the congregations I'm serving in,
not going to go.
That's not going to. That's not going to be a winning line.
I guess it's one of those. For me, it's one of those Sundays when you think, well, how can I use the liturgy to draw out some of the depth of the of all the scripture that's there? I mean, it's possible that those first verses of the Colossians reading might be an early hymn about God, and drawing on those words, and and you think, well, I wonder what hymn I could use that might not take everything, obviously, but might take some of the imagery to actually just bring this idea of the of the cosmic nature of Christ, that then actually is also the deeply personal Christ as well. So there's sort of hymns going through my head that might sort of help with that at the moment.
Well,
I think that's worth picking up on the hymn. The suggestion that it may have been based on a hymn there, and it helpful for me too, from that point of view, to think of it not as science, where God and Jesus are up in the darkness zapping galaxies here in the place of the kind of snap of a finger, but rather as a testimony to the, well, I quite like your quote, Neil, that God is, and that he is as he was in Jesus. That's kind of, and always was, that God always was as he we see him in Jesus. That's sort of that's sort of an eternal, and I think that was their experience of Christ. That in, you know, it was such a powerful experience that ever afterwards, whenever they thought of God, they thought of Jesus, and whenever they thought of Jesus, they thought of God. That the two became one for them in their faith, and as in a way, that's the way it is for us as well. The two can't be divided, and that gives us hope. I think because that's the thing that's not only lacking in soap operas, but it's also the thing which is sometimes lacking in our own lives. And if we believe that God is as he was in Jesus and always has been, as we know him in Jesus since the very beginning, always will be that way, there's hope.
Well, we've touched, friends, we've touched on liturgy worship already. I wonder if we might move into, you know, what we always try to do, which is to think a little bit together about how these four texts might then, in different ways, lead us into other dimensions of worship. So Blair, I was wondering, did you have anything in terms of other things?
Yeah, just one. And it's one I used on Easter Sunday, actually, and I think it does relate to the Genesis reading and Sarah giving birth late in life, and the odds against it being so ridiculously high, and how it's like that for us sometimes too. And I do think that there are nonetheless experiences of it, both in our own lives, of that sort of, maybe not exactly that sort of thing, but that sort of thing, it resonates with us, and also in nature. And so actually it was on another time when I was with Phil, and Listen was on, and Listen shared the story about a date. I don't know if you've read this story about this date that was found, I think sort of 10 years ago, date stones that were found in the Masada area. This is, if you Google it, I did Google it after listening to Listen, and these stones, they have dated these stones, dated the date stones to the time of Masada, to you know, they're about 2,000 years old.
Wow.
These stones, and they are also of an extinct form of date tree that that doesn't grow anymore. We didn't have any until they found these stones, and you probably know where I'm going with this. They were able to grow them and grow dates from them, wow. You know, from a yeah, it's just remarkable to me, that sort of thing. I just find it mind-blowing. You know, I read the article, apparently, that, you know, dates are a little sweeter and a little drier. They you know, they hypothesize now that maybe dates in that day were a little sweeter and a little drier. The tree looks like pretty much like a date tree, but a little bit different. There's quite a different types of date trees about, but this one has a, you know, sort of a bit unique looking. And anyway, for Easter Sunday morning, and what you might want to do with this text too, I took some dates for the kids, because we have kids at church, and these dates, by the way, were out of date. they were best before, you know, November or something. So, you know, I talked about dates being out of date, and can things still be good when they're too old? And anyway, that I told the story of the and then I gave them of an in-date date as well, that they could go home and eat.
Thank goodness, because I was imagining you were going to do something ghastly.
Make them eat it.
Eat old dates.
Church is poison. What is
Yeah,
this one
yeah,
there
yeah,
trying to
yeah,
do?
yeah, well, yeah, yeah. I think I didn't give him the one that was out of date. I just showed it to them. Don't touch this. Don't touch this.
That's an amazing story.
Don't try
Wow.
this at home, kids.
2,000 years.
Yeah, yeah. It's just staggering. There's a whole story about it on the internet. You can
Right.
Google it, and
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Wonderful, wonderful.
Nice. That's a great one. Okay. Thank you, Blair. And you've touched on, rather wonderfully weaving some of these texts into prayers and maybe hymns. Do you want to take us a bit further in that direction?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking, I mean, I think a hymn, if we're looking at, liturgy ideas, I think a hymn for me that kind of encapsulates something of what is in Colossians is before the world began. Which I think, I mean, obviously it draws on the imagery from John's gospel, but I think the links between the two are quite powerful here. So I think, and there's all that because that takes us from this kind of, before the world began, one word was there, and there's sort of this cosmic side, but then of course it ends with that I am for you, which I always just find extraordinary singing that hymn, and musically it's quite amazing as well, because it comes down to a very, very simple end at on the last line musically. So I think
that
yes, it is. Yeah, it's in Rejoice and Sing as well. It's John Bell Graham Moore one. Yeah. I think if I was there's some wonderful artwork of Mary and Martha out there, which I've used in the past when I've been looking at this reading, aware of its familiarity, and just given people some images to look at and talk about what do you see. And it just draws out, it just gets people a little bit away from the familiarity of the story, kind of into some exploring some different artists' impressions. And there really is some wonderful stuff. I mean, you'll be aware of that, Neil. Out there on the internet to actually explore. And I also found a wonderful prayer in Terry Hinks's book, which is called Praying the Way, which kind of brings Mary and Martha together. So kind of helps us not to have that dualism, but actually just the reconciling of actually this is a togetherness. So I thought that was a rather wonderful prayer. And as I said earlier, I think using the psalm both as a call to worship and as a blessing is a huge possibility as well here. Yeah.
Cool. Brilliant. What was the book for the prayer?
The book is Praying the Way by Terry Hinks. And it's the Bible Reading Fellowship. Terry is a YrC minister from Thames North Synod. So I used to promote his book when I was working for Thames North Synod.
And you're still doing it.
And still doing it. And he's got prayers that go with the four Gospels, that take passages from the four Gospels. So it's actually a really useful resource. And they're the kind of prayers that actually, yes, you would use them in worship, but also they might prompt a kind of thought for where you might take a reflection on a passage as well. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, you touched on the visual, and you won't be surprised to know that I couldn't resist thinking of artwork.
I thought you might.
I'm gonna share.
Be disappointed if you didn't.
Hang on a second. I realize I need to find the actual thing I'm going to use. Where is it? Right, there we go. So share that. So, I mean, and not least, of course, I mean, we're recording this at a time when Russia and Ukraine are torn apart by war. So there is something fairly poignant, I think, about having the story of the hospitality of Abraham and the probably, I guess, the greatest icon to be painted in Russia. Although I'm sure that my Orthodox friends would be able to correct me. Andrei Rublev in the 15th century paints the hospitality of Abraham, but it also is the icon of the Trinity. And, you know, it will be familiar to some people, but maybe not to everyone. This wonderful sense of the circle, you know, the heads, the bodies, the feet, creating this circle as a kind of perfect shape. The chalice on the table that has in it a heart, so a sense of what is being offered and celebrated and blessed is literally the giving of life and the source of life. All sorts of wonderful theories. I mean, the great thing about Andrei Rublev's icon is that he never left us a nice, neat, you know, annotated version in which he said, when you look at this bit, I want you to think about this. But people, you know, have lots of fun saying, well, which one is God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit? Are they just angels? You know, is that the other thing that's going on? These are angelic visitors. Let's not get overly hung up on whether which one is which and so on. But anyway, there's just something about that which might be a way of taking us a little bit more into the passage from Genesis. But also, I think, just again, it's about relationship. And I mean, as we've talked, you know, as we've thought about the Colossians, as we thought about Mary and Martha and Jesus, as we thought about the Psalm, there's a lot in there about what does it mean to be in relationship, to be in communion. And then there are, as Anne has said, there are a great many paintings. If you just Google Martha and Mary, you'll be taken to all sorts of things. So this is one of this is Vermeer, and it's an interesting one, not least because Vermeer didn't really paint that many biblical scenes. I mean, Vermeer is the artist who does, you know, the girl with the pearl earring and things like that. There aren't many times when Vermeer does a straight biblical picture, but this is Christ in the house of Martha and Mary. And I think, Anne, you touched on, you talked a little bit about how Jesus is kind of plonked in the middle as the mediator. The two sisters don't actually talk to each other. Yeah. And I think Vermeer gives us a little bit of that sense of kind of, you know, here they are. He's playing with the story in terms of the expressions on the faces, the way in which Jesus is pointing, but also kind of there's an openness to the sort of pictorial language. There's almost a kind of nonchalance in the way Jesus is leaning back and just saying, well, you know, come on, what about what's really going on here? And again, not least because it's a familiar passage to perhaps, if you're in a church that can project, then to project something. If you're in a church that needs something printed, maybe to have something printed, bearing in mind all the rules and regulations, of course, about copyright and doing it properly. But those were just a couple of things that I thought, you know, I guess I too was struck that there's an awful lot going on in these texts, and in creating an act of worship, it might be important to have some time when it's not full of words. And I was just thinking, you know, maybe one way of doing that is to just say to people, let's listen to the text, but then let's just stop, and rather than, you know, trying to fill in with lots of words, let's just let the text speak, and maybe the images can do that. So there we are, friends. We've traveled our way through these 4 biblical texts, and I'm hugely grateful to Anne and to Blair for helping us along the way. But as we always do, we recognize that many of you who are watching this will be yourselves preparing worship and getting ready to preach. And so we'd like to end, as we always do, with the offering of a prayer. And Anne, you're going to pray for us.
Yes. Let's pray. Oh God, you have made yourself known in Jesus, and so there is hope. And so we pray now, as we open ourselves to your word, that we will have the grace to follow your way, that we will listen, and that we will step out in faith with you, knowing that as we encounter you, our lives will be changed and your grace will sustain us. So bless us now as we prepare, as we journey on, as we live as your people. In the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.